Hey kids, how you doing? Today we are going to be discussing the end of the war, end of World War II. The article's title is "The End of the Axis: The Pacific." Germany, by this time, it's the summer of 1945. Germany has already surrendered. Hitler's committed suicide, so that part of the war is over. But fighting raged on in the Pacific throughout that end of the spring and summer, and finally at the end of the summer in 1945, the war comes to an end when the United States used a secret weapon that they had been developing throughout the war that shocked the world and brought the war to an end. And we're going to kind of talk about exactly what that was and kind of the debate that still rages on about whether or not it was right for the U.S. to do it. So let's take a look at it. If you could please follow along while I read. World War II, the end of the Axis, the Pacific. The president's dead. In November 1944, Franklin Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented fourth term as President of the United States. He was first elected back in 1932 during the depths of the Great Depression. In his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt proposed and Congress passed a flurry of New Deal legislation. Since then, every president is judged by his first 100 days in office against what Roosevelt accomplished. He was reelected in 1936 in a landslide. Then, with war approaching, he ran and won a third term in 1940, the only president ever to do so. By 1944, Roosevelt was in poor health. He really had no desire to run for a fourth term. But after shepherding the USA through the Great Depression and much of World War II, the American people could not really even imagine someone different in charge anymore. He was persuaded to run again and won easily. 3 months after his fourth inauguration, after complaining of a headache, Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage. The nation, which did not know of Roosevelt's worsening health, was stunned. The United States had a new president for the first time in 13 years. The new president, Harry Truman, was from Independence, Missouri. When he became president, very few Americans heard of him or knew anything about him. But Truman was a tough, no-nonsense politician who rose in the Democratic Party, supporting Roosevelt's New Deal in Dust Bowl-ravaged Missouri. He fought against corruption and waste in government. This little-known man from the middle of America now had to see World War II to its conclusion. Return to the Philippines. Following the humiliating defeat on the Bataan Peninsula in 1942, the United States fell back in the Pacific and had to reorganize the Pacific War from Australia. General Douglas MacArthur vowed to the people of the Philippines that someday he and the Americans would return. The Japanese fought toward Australia, but were defeated at the Battle of the Coral Sea and on the island of New Guinea. From there, the U.S. Army and Marines began the long process of taking the Pacific back from the Japanese. The United States Navy Pacific Fleet, after being almost totally destroyed in the attack on Pearl Harbor, began to reassert itself in the Pacific. After the Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy defeated the Japanese at the Battle of Midway, sinking 3 aircraft carriers and crippling the Imperial Japanese Navy. After Midway, the Navy began constricting the Japanese holdings in the Pacific ever closer to the Asian mainland. Meanwhile, the Marines and U.S. Army soldiers fought their way from island to island, making formerly unknown spots in the Pacific world famous. Places like Saipan, the Marianas, and the Marshall Islands were scenes of fierce fighting where thousands of Americans and virtually every Japanese defender were killed. And there's a pretty cool picture off of Saipan of an American tank still there. You know, there are several of them that it never got ashore during the invasion, so it still sits just off the beach. Just kind of rusted out, and but it always, especially in color, is kind of a really striking photo. In 1944, the Americans were ready to return to the Philippines. The Japanese had no intention of giving up the islands easily, though. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, just off the Philippines, was the largest naval battle in history. It featured the last time battleships would engage each other, as well as the first Japanese use of the kamikaze, which were suicide attacks into American naval craft. And there you can see a map of the Philippines and Leyte Gulf, as well as Americans desperately shooting at a Japanese plane because it was going to crash into the USS Yorktown. So the only thing to do was shoot it down before it got to the boat. The Destroyer of Worlds. After the German surrender and VE, Victory in Europe Day, in May 1945, the Allies' entire effort became focused on finishing off the Japanese Empire. While the Japanese were reeling from defeats at the hands of the Americans, they were not defeated yet. In fact, the Japanese showed no inclination to ever give up, even if it meant extermination. Many Pacific battles ended with virtually all Japanese defenders killed to the very last man. In 1945, the Americans invaded islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which were considered Japanese home territory. Even civilians began to commit ritual suicide rather than submit to the Americans. With this in mind, the American military began to grimly plan for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. In 1944, almost 500,000 Allied personnel were killed or wounded in the D-Day invasion of Europe, and that was considered a massive success. Planners believed over 1 million Americans could die in a similar invasion of Japan, not to mention that it might be necessary to kill every Japanese defender in order to end the war, which would be many more millions. The new president, Harry Truman, faced what seemed like an impossible dilemma: how to tell 1 million more American mothers that their sons were dead. But Truman knew something almost nobody else did. There was another option. The USA had a new weapon capable of ending the war. Early in the war, American scientists began work on the Manhattan Project. The purpose was to harness the power of nuclear fission. Over the course of the war, Americans and British scientists were able to construct different types of bombs of enormous power never before seen in human history. By the summer of 1945, the weapons were ready to be used if the president wished to do so. Faced with the possibility of millions of Americans and Japanese casualties from an invasion of Japan, Truman decided to use a new nuclear weapon. On August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, flew high over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. They had little to fear from Japanese aircraft anymore. Circling over the city, they released the uranium-based weapon nicknamed Little Boy. Within seconds of the bomb's detonation, Hiroshima ceased to exist. 70 to 80,000 people were killed immediately, and 70% of the city's buildings were destroyed in the single explosion. Immediately after the atomic bomb attack, President Truman warned Japan to surrender, or they would face a rain of ruin from the skies. The Japanese high command believed the U.S. had only one atomic bomb, so they did not surrender. On August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, killing 40,000 more in an instant. Finally, with 2 cities in ashes and promises of more to come, the Japanese emperor himself announced the surrender, the first time ordinary Japanese people had heard his voice. It was officially signed on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, ending the war 6 years and 1 day after Germany invaded Poland. And that is the end of World War II.